Good morning. Good morning. Could I have your attention, please? Thank you very much. We're about to start in about 1 minute's time. We're just grabbing some water for our candidates. Two things. If you have a cell phone or something that goes beep, please turn it off now. Secondly, you'll notice that there's a number of rows of chairs here that are filled. If students on the main floor would like to move forward. Good morning. You are welcome to. Good morning. Could I have your attention, please? That's fine. Otherwise, just feel free to filter forward. Thank you very much. We're about to start in about 1 minute's time. We're just grabbing some water for our candidates. Two things. If you have a cell phone or something that goes beep, please turn it off now. Secondly, you'll notice that there's a number of rows of chairs here that are filled. If students on the main floor would like to move forward. Good morning. You are welcome to. Good morning. Could I have your attention, please? That's fine. Otherwise, just feel free to filter forward. Thank you very much. We're about to start in about 1 minute's time. We're just grabbing some water for our candidates. Two things. If you have a cell phone or something that goes beep, please turn it off now. Secondly, you'll notice that there's a number of rows of chairs here that are filled. If students on the main floor would like to move forward. Good morning. You are welcome to. Good morning. Could I have your attention, please? That's fine. Otherwise, just feel free to filter forward. Thank you very much. Good morning. We're about to start in about 1 minute's time. We're just grabbing some water for. Welcome to the Brentwood College. Two things. Federal candidates cell meeting. Phone or something that please stand for a brief musical presentation that befits this important event. Secondly, you'll notice that there's a number of rows of chairs here that are filled. If students on the main floor would like to move forward. Good morning. You are welcome to. Good morning. Could I have your attention, please? That's fine. Otherwise, just feel free to filter forward. Thank you very much. Good morning. We're about to start in about 1 minute's time. We're just grabbing some water for. Welcome to the Brentwood College. Two things. Federal candidates cell meeting. Phone or something that please stand for a brief musical presentation that befits this important event. Secondly, you'll notice that there's a number of rows of chairs here that are filled. If students on the main floor would like to move forward. Good morning. You are welcome to. Good morning. Could I have your attention, please? That's fine. Otherwise, just feel free to filter forward. Thank you very much. Good morning. We're about to start in about 1 minute's time. We're just grabbing. They say that music calms the savage beast, but I'm not sure that qualifies, so thank you. I would like to introduce, in no particular order, our guests this morning. From my left here, Ms. Hunt Janucci, representing the Green Party. If you wouldn't mind just waving people so we know who you are. Save your clapping to the end, folks. We'll keep this as unbiased as possible. Mr. Alistair McGregor from the NDP Party, at the far end. Dr. Martin Barker from the Conservative Party, right here. And finally, Mr. Luke Krayenhoff from the Liberal Party. Thank you very much. Now, just as singing is a controlled scream, which I'm sure you'd agree after that, debate of this sort is a controlled argument. And the means by which we're going to control it have some rules of engagement, which I'm going to explain now. If you have a question, then you're going to take 30 seconds and no longer to ask it. For those here on the stage who are going to attempt to answer it as best they can, they have a minute to do so, and no longer. I'm going to indicate how that time period is going to end. Some people use flags, some people use various things, but I think the most effective would be, especially considering that I'm off to the side, would be an oral cue. And so with 10 seconds to spare in any circumstance, 30 seconds, 1 minute, or what have you, I will simply clap my hands lightly, indicating you have 10 seconds to round it out, finish it up. If for some reason the questioner or the answerer goes on longer, I'll simply say thank you very much in as polite a fashion as possible, but I'm basically cutting you off. A good question shouldn't take longer than 30 seconds, and a good answer that's been considered and thought through should take no longer than a minute. So that's our assertion. I hope you'll support us. It's really too bad if you don't. So, it has been attributed to Voltaire the saying, "I do not agree with a word you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it," which in our circumstance means we are not appreciative of any heckling this morning. We would ask that if something is funny, feel free to laugh. If something is upsetting, feel free to do whatever noise that requires, but you'd keep it relatively professional and polite. The issues that we're contending with today differ and actually contest with one another, but the individuals are worthy of respect. And so this is a basic rule in debate for those of you in that club, and this is a basic rule that we would probably aspire to here at Brentwood as well. There is going to be an opportunity for a redirect. And what that means is, if the person asking the question wasn't satisfied by the answer, they have the opportunity to rephrase it once. That shouldn't happen more than perhaps 2 or 3 times in a time period such as what we have, 90 minutes. Another redirect opportunity would be if the member from the Green Party answers a question and the member from the Liberal Party feels that he has an utterly different and contrasting answer which may be helpful for the electorate to determine, he would ask for the opportunity of a redirect just by a quick raising of hand. Again, that's only one redirect opportunity. So I realize this can get a little messy sometimes on contentious issues, but hopefully, and I will be doing my best to make it fair and reasonable across the 4 in the panel here before us. Any questions? Fantastic. The format of today was to include what you've just seen and heard, and then we will have some prepared questions from various students who've thought through these questions carefully, revealed these questions to the various constituency offices for our candidates to consider carefully, and so it's a prepared question with a prepared answer. That'll take, there's about 10 questions, so not a long time. Same time periods will ensue. And thereafter, we'll open the floor to whoever would like to speak. We have 2 microphones set up on either side of the main auditorium here. Should you wish to ask a question, you will simply come to the microphone that is easiest for you to get to, and there may be a line, in which case you'll wait until that person ahead of you or people ahead of you ask their questions, and then you will ask yours. We would ask that you would indicate to whom you're phrasing the question. So this is for Ms. Janucci, and then ask your question. An answer will be given. You will stand and wait for that answer to be completed. Again, this is politeness. And then sit down. Hopefully that makes sense. Last advice as a public speaking coach: speak slowly. This is a big space, and microphone amplification tends to distort things very easily. So just speak slowly, slower than you would normally in normal speech. Otherwise it could get garbled, and you may be asking for a rephrasing. Okay, so we'll start with the grade 8s. We have 2 questions. And I don't mind in which order you go in, but feel free to come to a microphone and ask your question.
To NDP candidate, Mr. McGregor, your party has indicated that they have plans to reduce greenhouse gases. Could you please outline a few practical strategies that you plan to implement?
Absolutely, and I'm really glad that you asked that kind of question, because I believe that climate change is going to be the defining issue of the 21st century, and it's about time that we had a federal government in Ottawa that actually took the issue seriously and had a practical plan. The NDP, we have prepared, previously we had Jack Layton's Climate Change Accountability Act that we introduced in 3 previous parliaments, and we would reintroduce that. It's going to set hard targets, reducing greenhouse gas emissions to a level that's 80% below 1990 levels by the year 2050. We're going to implement a cap-and-trade system with a polluter pay principle, and we're also going to redirect oil subsidies that the federal government sends to oil and gas companies and redirect that to renewable energy, because I believe that's going to be the next big economic opportunity for our country. Thank you.
Thank you. An opportunity for a redirect was asked for by our Mr. Kranhoff. Feel free.
Well, Mr. Barker, actually.
My apologies, Mr. Barker.
Yeah. Thank you. I would like to just set some facts straight. Canada actually has a very good greenhouse gas emissions record. Currently, Canada has the lowest greenhouse gas emissions per capita and per GDP that it has ever had in its history. Canada, the Conservative government, are pursuing lowering greenhouse gas emissions by examining each industry individually and one at a time, looking for methods and technologies and regulations to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. It'll be very difficult on our economy if we just go cold turkey on carbon emissions, as my opponents would like us to do. Unfortunately, we're all consumers. We all still drive on roads. We still drive cars, and even electric cars have a significant carbon footprint. And we have to recognize that we are still using carbon. The world is still using carbon, and we have to seek methods and technologies to lower carbon emissions. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have the other grade 8 question.
My question is for Mr. Barker. Your party has indicated that it supports the Keystone Pipeline. Hillary Clinton has recently stated that she opposes its construction. So how might this influence your party's stance on the issue?
Thank you so much for your question. You know, the Keystone Pipeline is a really interesting debate. The U.S. State Department has twice said that it will not increase greenhouse gas emissions. And the fact is that our country is losing $5 billion per year in government revenues because we need to sell our oil to an international market. Currently, we have one market, that being the U.S., and the Americans are able to sell their gasoline and oil cheaper because they get subsidized by Canadian taxpayers. You know, ultimately, the Keystone Pipeline is 1,900 kilometers in length. And in the U.S., since the process began on the Keystone Pipeline, 20,000 kilometers of pipeline have been built in the U.S. And the U.S. is now the #1 oil producer in the world, producing their own greenhouse gas emissions. You know, we can't force the United States to help us out. If they don't build the Keystone Pipeline, we need to have 2 partners in it. We have to seek other markets for our oil.
Thank you very much. Well timed. We'll now move to some of the other more senior students' questions, starting, hopefully you know the order that you're in. This has to do with peacekeeping missions. Right. Well, that's awkward, isn't it? I'll ask it. This comes from one of our student members here. This is for the Conservative Party candidate, Mr. Barker. How will you restore Canada's role as a leader in peacekeeping missions?
Once again, thank you for that question. I would like to say I don't think Canada has lost its status as a peacekeeping nation. And I think people have forgotten that we have been in several wars since 1993. We were in Iraq. We were in Afghanistan in 2001. Right now in the world, there's not a lot of opportunities for peacekeeping. The areas which are experiencing trouble are high conflict. And a place like Iraq, Canada has a history of doing what is right, and we are doing what is right in Iraq. We are standing with our allies, and we are protecting the innocents, people who are being brutalized by literally evil regimes. There's genocide there, there's true evil there, and Canada needs to protect those people to allow them to live in their homes, have a good life with their families. I'm sure that if a peacekeeping mission was offered to Canada, we would take it, but unfortunately there's not a lot of those missions available right now.
Thank you very much. Redirect from the Green Party candidate.
I would like to just challenge my colleague here, because I believe that under the regime of Stephen Harper and the Conservatives, we have lost our reputation on the front as peacekeepers. I was proud to grow up thinking that Canada was a country of peacekeepers and that we worked under humanitarian measures and as diplomats. We have dropped on the world stage from being in the top 5 down to number 67, along with Portugal. So I don't really think that that's accurate. And as Captain Trevor Green said, who took his helmet off in Afghanistan in respect to the tribal elders, but was attacked by an axe-wielding person, he said, Canada must get our reputation back. And that's what the Green Party intends to do.
Thank you very much. Sorry, one redirect only. This is unfortunate. In terms of the format of this so-called debate, there's really only a little opportunity for tete-a-tete. We're trying to provide you with an opportunity to give contrasting opinions, and we'll try and vary it up as much as we can. So my apologies if more redirect was wanted on that obviously spicy question. Next question has to do with foreign aid spending. Who's taking that one? Please come forward. And if we could get the person who's going to ask about pay equity as well to come forward so that we're ready in the wings.
This question is for the Liberal candidate. Your party has promised to increase foreign aid spending, which is currently 0.24% of GDP. Why is this important?
Well, thank you. It's a great question, and thank you for asking it. Foreign aid is an essential element of what we do as Canadians, and I would echo what Fran was saying about our reputation. The first part of it is really that we need to reestablish our reputation as a peace-brokering nation in the world, a mediating nation, one that when we speak, people listen because our reputation is enhanced. And historically, under Liberal governments, we've had that. That has been diminished over time. But specifically to your question, we do have a commitment to raise it to 0.7% of GDP. And the reason we want to do that, like some people say, why are you spending money around the world when we have problems at home? Well, first of all, we are a wealthy country, and we have a duty to our fellow citizens to help them in times of need, and we need to do that. We're very concerned about the ongoing decline when the need for overseas development is significant, as the crises have been developing recently in recent years. So thank you.
Thank you. Redirect from Mr. Barker.
Thank you. I just want to correct my friend here in a few things. Canada has not lost its status in the world. I can read from this list about how Canada ranks in various things. The most reputable and admired nation in the world, number 1, Canada. The best country for business among the G20, Canada. Best G7 growth since 2008, Canada. Real GDP growth among G7 nations, Canada. The government net debt GDP ratio, best among G7, Canada. Our leader has been awarded in 2012 the best statesman of the world. Last year, he was a nominee for the Nobel laureate. Canada is still swinging well above its head. It is the most admired nation in the world, and people come here because they want to live here, because we are a great country. That has not been reduced under the Conservatives, as my friends here would like everyone to think.
Thank you. We have another question.
Hi there, I have a question for the Green Party. So what will you do to ensure equal pay and the closing of the gender gap in a country where this gender gap is actually twice the global average?
Yeah, it's common knowledge that across Canada, women receive, on average, $8,000 a year less than men. And we need to raise awareness, and we need to create legislation that is equality for all. And being the status of women critic for the Green Party, I'm particularly interested in that area. Being a woman as well, also being a First Nations woman. There needs to be change in violence against women. We need to create safe spaces where we can have those conversations. But equality is more complex than just pay, and we need to look at it through a lens of what are all of the issues facing women. But pay equality certainly is something that we advocate for, and it's in our party platform. And an inquiry for the murdered and missing Aboriginal women and girls across this country.
Thank you. Would anyone take a redirect? Go ahead, Mr. McGregor.
Yeah, I think what Fran said was bang on, but I also want to add another thing. I think bringing in a national childcare plan is going to be extremely important to addressing this problem as well. It's an issue that hits home for me. I'm a father of 3-year-old twin daughters, and I would love to see them grow up in a Canada where their work is valued equally, no matter their gender. I think that, I've spoken with a lot of young families who are really struggling with the costs of childcare, and it's disproportionately women who are forced to stay home as the caregivers. They don't often have the same opportunities when children are involved, so I think that bringing down the costs of daycare is not only good social policy, but it makes great economic sense in allowing families to realize their full potential, allowing women to pursue those career goals that they've always dreamed about.
Thank you. Another question, go ahead.
Okay. This is for the NDP candidate. Should the federal government mandate vaccination against preventable diseases?
That's a good question. Under our current system of government, it is the provincial governments that do have jurisdiction in this area, and I know currently that Ontario, Manitoba, and New Brunswick are the ones that have legislation that mandate vaccination in order to attend school. There are exemption clauses in each province for medical, religious, or ideological reasons. I believe in vaccines, I will say that first off the bat, but I don't believe that making vaccinations mandatory is a way of achieving the aim of eradicating outbreaks. I think that a much better method is using education. I think that when people are confronted with a mandate to get their kids vaccinated, that's an incredibly personal choice. And it comes down to whether the state has a right to do that or the individual. I think an education program would have far more success.
Thank you. Redirect from Ms. Santonucci.
Yes, I agree with Alistair on this one, but I want to take it as an opportunity to say, as far as peacekeeping, we have dropped to 67th, and so my colleague hasn't mentioned that. And as far as women's equality, I believe if the NDP leader was very serious about women's equality, he would have actually sat in on the debate that over 270 women's organizations across this country called for. Elizabeth May and Justin Trudeau were actually going to be in on that debate. Thomas Mulcair said he would, but instead followed the lead of Stephen Harper and bowed out. So if we really want to talk about women's equality, there was the prime venue to do it.
Thank you. We have another question.
Mr. Barker with the Conservative Party, what are your views on the Northern Gateway Pipeline project?
Thank you so much for your question. It seems to be a popular topic. Pipelines in Canada require an extensive consultation. It's taken years and years for the Northern Gateway or the Northern Gateway pipeline to be produced, and $1 billion at least. There are 750,000 pages of consultation to go through. The fact is that our oil needs to get to international markets so we can get a fair value for it. And the truth is that we are all still consumers. I know some of you probably have cars and drive, that's gasoline, we drive on roads. And many of you probably don't realize that the oil that we use in Northern Alberta is actually the main ingredient for most of the roads in North America. So there's a demand for our product, and that demand is not going to go away because we don't make pipelines. The alternative is rail cars. And rail cars spill at a much higher rate. They have a much higher rate of greenhouse gas emissions. And they're dangerous. We've seen that in Lac Megantic, and many people died. So we need to build pipelines for our international markets.
Thank you. Redirect from Mr. Kranhoff. And I would ask for the next questioners coming up, and thank you for doing such a good job of being timely. Please speak clearly into the microphone. We're having a little trouble hearing up here. Thank you, Mr. Cranehoff.
Yep, well, thank you. And Northern Gateway is a good example, and Keystone was mentioned earlier, and there's also Kinder Morgan and Burnaby, and there's also the Bamberton LNG plant, which of course affects us closer to home here. I think of all the parties, we've got the best approach to assessing the merits of each of these projects. We don't look at one and say, well, maybe yes, maybe no, environmental here, and then a mixed bag of approach. We've got a three-pronged approach to deciding whether any of these resource projects are worth undertaking. First, is there buy-in from First Nations communities locally? Second, do environmental assessments agree that this is a good project? Third, is there a social license or a community license to approve this? And so with Keystone, we got yes for all three. Now, negotiating with the Americans is a separate question. Northern Gateway, we got no. We don't believe that there is that those 3 points are satisfied in full. All three have to be satisfied. Bamberton, we've got First Nations are interested in this. It's got an environmental assessment. We still need to assess the social license, and as your MP, my job is to assess that at our community level and report that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So my question is for the Liberal Party candidates, Mr. Cranehoff. I understand this is a provincial issue, but since the federal government still has a tremendous amount of influence on it, what is the Liberal Party's policy on public education moving forward?
Well, thank you, and it's a good question to springboard off of. You know, in electoral campaigns, a lot of issues are brought up, and so those of you who are studying the Constitution in your law classes probably know about sections 91 and 92, which delineate provincial and federal responsibilities. The province has responsibility exclusively for K-12 education. The federal government has responsibility, a shared responsibility for post-secondary and preschool. So on the post-secondary front, we see our role, first of all, to really encourage trades education, make that a reality for those who want to do it, make student loans easier, and so that there's not a crippling debt on students. On the preschool front, we are going to be consulting with all the provinces on a national early learning and child care framework, because we want to get the expertise of the provinces, fit what works for them, and then as a federal government backstop it where we can and have the responsibility under the Constitution to do that. Thank you.
Redirect? No. Right. Moving on to the next question then. Do we have that next person? This had to do with environmental concerns and the Arctic region. Thank you.
Hi. This is for the Green Party candidate.
Loudly, please. Right into the microphone. 2 fingers off.
Okay. Yeah. Taking into consideration environmental concerns and our understanding of climate change, how should Canada use the resource-rich Arctic region?
Thank you. Well, we need to protect the Arctic. When we're looking at the drastic weather changes, the rising ocean level, often what we're seeing is has to do with the melting ice caps in the Arctic. And the complex web of life, the chain of life up there, doesn't have a voice to stand up for it. And I want to be that voice. The Green Party wants to be that voice. There's lots of mining exploration up there for minerals. It is too sensitive a place for drilling. The fish habitat for people in Alaska and the First Nations, but it also goes back to what we were talking about here with pipelines and LNG and using precious water. We don't need any more reviews. We're in an earthquake zone here, and the science is in. Water is sacred, no to LNG, and no more tankers, increased tankers on our coast.
Thank you. Last question that's been pre-prepared.
This is for the NDP party. Tuition increases continue to exceed inflation in most parts of Canada. What would you do to make post-secondary study more affordable?
Thank you for the question. I'm 36 years old, so I'm not too far away from my previous university studies. I went to UVic and to Royal Roads, and I remember how large that debt was. Today, the average debt is between $27,000 and $35,000 for each post-secondary student, and I think when we're asking these young members of society to enter our economy and start a new life, that's a huge burden. So one of the things that we've pledged to do as a federal government is we want to invest an additional $250 million into federal grants, emphasis on low-income students. We want to immediately begin phasing out federal student loan interest and eliminating it completely by year 7. And we are also going to work to do what we tried to do in previous parliaments, and that is implement a Canada Post-Secondary Education Act, which would force the federal government to work with provinces and territories to make sure that post-secondary education is not only affordable, but it's accessible and it's inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you. Redirect from Ms. Hunter-Nucci.
Thank you. Yes, and the Green Party proposes to take that a step further. And it isn't a radical thought. I mean, in other countries, especially in Europe, there is tuition-free education, and they're doing quite well. We propose to immediately eliminate the interest on student debt, and then in year 2 or 3 to reduce student debt to $10,000 per person to make it manageable, which will help with the things like childcare. But that what we're working towards is actually having free tuition for post-secondary students. That will require working with the provinces, but we need to be competitive on the world market. And we have great minds like yours right here, and we need to know that education is accessible to everybody. And I'm still going? 1 minute?
Yeah, 12 seconds.
But so supporting post-secondary education, job skills training is a key priority for the Green Party, especially as we move to stimulate our economy and have people trained to set about in retrofitting homes across the country, and for engineers to deal with regenerative energy in our infrastructure, schools, and buildings.
Thank you. I'm not being completely militant. I mean, yes, I'm looking at a timepiece, but I'm paying attention to your punctuation as well. So if it's a comma, I'll let you go. If it's a period, then I'll probably interrupt you. We now have an opportunity to open the floor to anyone here who would like to ask a question with the same restrictions on time. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope you'll maybe give me just a few more seconds here. I want to thank Brentwood College for holding this exercise in democracy. If the students that are here pay attention and read between the lines, they're going to learn how to parse politics, which is an important thing that you need to do, because everyone sounds great when they're giving a stump speech, right? My name's Alistair Haythornthwaite. I'm the 5th registered candidate. My party, the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada, is focused on the democratic renewal of Canada, and here's my short question. There is a democratic deficit in Canada where people have little influence on the decisions that affect their lives and communities, and I'm going to ask all the parties, how would your party address this problem?
Well, perhaps we can start at one end and work to the other then. So if we want to start at my nearest side and work down to the far end to this question.
Participatory democracy is one of the 6 founding principles of the Green Party, and it is one of the overarching themes that we strive for. And we believe that that has to start in the House of Commons, and where true democracy will live is when MPs don't have to vote as a bloc with their leaders, because that isn't true democracy. Even in the Constitution, there is no indication of parties. We have created this adversarial position. What it calls for are for MPs to represent their constituents and to bring your needs, our needs, to Ottawa to be brought forward for the larger Canadian decision-making. And right now, with the 3 parties, that isn't able to happen. I have the pledge from Elizabeth May that I can vote with my conscience and for you.
Thank you. Mr. Kranhoff, anything to add or take away?
Yes, thank you. Excellent question. And I'm glad it was brought up, because a Liberal government commits to having, if elected, this will be the last first-past-the-post election in Canada. We are going to strike, so that's the system whereby the person who gets the most votes in every riding wins. The downside of that is you can get the most votes with maybe 30-35%, and that means 65% of the riding voted against you or on the national level. So very often what you'll have is in the country, most people didn't want this government in, and the people who maybe got 30% or 25% are frozen out of the discussion. So we are committing to this being the last first-past-the-post election in Canadian history. We're going to strike an all-party committee to look at things like online voting, democratic reform, proportional representation, a ranked ballot, and perhaps even like Australia, mandatory voting. So this will be a sea change in Canada, and we're going to be at the forefront of making that happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Barker?
Thank you. This is a really important election, and I'm actually quite surprised it's not discussed more in the media. Each party has a stance on reforming government. The Conservative stance is that we will not reform government without a plebiscite from the people, a referendum, endorsing that change. We have successfully run our country for 148 years on the Westminster system, and we are essentially the best country in the world because of it. So one of the systems that's being suggested is called proportional representation, and it is poorly described on the party that is promoting it on their website. What some people don't realize is proportional representation allows a party to assign non-elected people from a list to ensure that the parties are equally represented. That's not really a democratic way. It's important that the people know what they're voting for. Campaigns are about issues, and when you're voting for somebody you don't know who's going to get in, you're not voting for the issues, you're not voting for the policies. And the reason 40% of the people get elected or require an election is because 40% support that policy of that party. The other 60% have their own issues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Could we have Mr. McGregor round out that panel?
Well, I think our current voting system is a relic of bygone centuries, and it absolutely must be changed. We have a system that in the last federal election gave the Conservatives an absolute majority in Parliament with only 39% of the vote. That is not fair. This current system gives rise to false majorities, and the government is only obliged to follow a narrow band of interests. That is not true democracy. We do need proportional representation. It's something that is a central policy plank of the NDP. We need more voices at the table. We need to arrive at things by consensus. I had the pleasure of working for our retiring Member of Parliament, Jean Crowder, for 7 years. I saw the difference an elected representative can make in a community. She set an amazing example. She was an amazing mentor to me. Her best words of advice to me were always remember who you represent. I want it to be known that I will always vote my conscience and in the best interests of this community, because ultimately it is you who I am accountable to, not Ottawa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sir.
My question is directed at the Green Party, the NDP, and the Liberals.
I'm sorry, we're going to go with, actually, apologies for interrupting you, sir. We did go outside of our standard rules, just in deference to our member from the Marxist-Leninist Party. However, I will actually restrict all future questions, including yours, to one candidate and one candidate alone, please. Otherwise, we just simply won't get through them all. Okay? So choose one.
You choose.
No, sorry, you'll have to direct it.
Okay, I'll pick the Liberals. How's that?
Okay, thank you very much. What was your question again, just because I've interrupted you?
For the last 10 years, my Canada has disappeared. I used to live in a country that sent peacekeepers out. I used to live in a country that didn't bomb other countries. I used to live in a country where we went out and got people who were suffering and brought them to Canada and gave them new lives. And they didn't have to have their applications passed through the Prime Minister's office in order to do that. I am less proud of Canada than I ever was. How will you bring my Canada back?
Thank you. Great question, and it speaks to... Your question speaks to a growing frustration amongst Canadians in terms of how Canadians are perceived. There was a time when Canadians would go abroad with a Canadian flag in their backpack and they would be applauded and welcomed with open arms, and that's just not the case anymore. And we might have rankings economically, but in terms of our international presence, we've lost that. And one thing to remember when you're electing a party is what's their record in office. And the Liberal government has had long periods of time when we have been in office, and we have a stellar record, in my opinion, dealing with international issues. We built Canada's reputation. It was Lester Pearson who created the peacekeeping forces initially in the Suez crisis in the 60s. And so we've got a reputation on that front. We continue to have that decline, and our government will bring that back. And we want everybody who travels abroad to be proud to be a Canadian again. Thank you.
Mr. Barker, redirect.
Thank you. I feel like I have to defend Canada all the time. Canada is, I read a list, Canada is number one on so many things. And if people talk about the Canada that was, at one time it was a country with out-of-control Liberal deficits. And then it was a country of extreme austerity under the Liberals. My friends over here have never managed an economy to prosperity, and in fact they have wrecked many economies. The fact is, right now, Canada does not have opportunities for peacekeeping because the world is in conflict. And we have a history of standing up in conflicts. World War II, World War I, Korea, Afghanistan. And Afghanistan was not a conservative war. Iraq was not the current Prime Minister's war. In fact, the fewest numbers of wars that we've been involved in, with the fewest numbers of troops, are right now under the current government. We cannot turn our back on people who need our help. And that's what the Conservative government, and that is what Canada stands up proudly to do. We lead the world in humanitarian aid. We are assisting 1.2 million refugees in the Middle East right now. Canada has a history that we can be truly proud of. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
My question is for the Conservative representative. What is your opinion on the current niqab debate, and do you think that it's really worth our time to be spending so much effort and energy on something that affects relatively few people in Canada?
It's not the political parties that choose ultimately what we're going to concentrate on. The niqab and the burqa are issues that Canadians are talking about and that Canadians want to hear about. The truth is that the Conservative government doesn't care if you wear a niqab all the time. In a courtroom, it's Canadian values and customs to see your face. And in countries, Islamic countries such as Egypt and Pakistan, you are not permitted to wear the niqab or burqa in those courtrooms, and those are in Islamic countries. You know, a lot of Canadians would not make a deal. You wouldn't buy a house from somebody who wore a mask. In Canada, we have values where when we're making a deal, when you're making an oath, we look at each other's eyes, our face, and that's a Canadian value. And that's what the Conservatives are protecting, Canadian values in court. And at the moment when you are swearing your oath and allegiance to our country, that's when you want to see the honesty of that person's face. People are free to wear the niqab and burqa as much as they want at other times.
Thank you. As a reflection of national politics, it's only appropriate that the NDP candidate speak to this.
Well, I disagree with you completely, Martin, that political parties are not responsible for bringing this issue. This issue was sidelined when the TPP was signed. It basically blew the niqab off the debate table. Mr. Harper expertly brought it back by openly musing about preventing federal civil servants from wearing the niqab while they prepare. It's a classic wedge issue. It's divisive politics. And you know what other Canadian values are? Acceptance of cultural differences and respect for the rule of law. This is an issue that belongs in the courts. The courts are already well on their way to ruling it. And I think that this has been a perfect wedge issue just as a distraction for the 10 years of the Harper government's record that they don't want you to really talk about. It's a side issue in the great scheme of things in this great country of ours. There are so many more important issues to be talking about rather than a veil over a woman's face.
I'm sorry, but we're going to have to close that question out. It's unfortunate because it's obviously a hotbed topic, but you see there's many people asking many other questions as well. Would you like to come from this side, please?
I would ask this question of the Conservative candidate. Do you believe that political smear campaigns actually further the democratic process as a whole, or are they just political weapons that are used to detract from opposing parties? And if you say that they're just used as weapons, why would your party even consider running campaigns such as these?
Thank you.
Well, it's not just the Conservatives. I would say the Conservative election are running the smallest smear campaign. The first book that was ever written about campaigning was written by Nero's brother in Rome several thousands of years ago, and parties still follow that book. And I would love to give you a lecture on that someday if you guys would like. But the fact is part of the methodology for campaigning is to undermine the belief and competence of your opponents. And unfortunately, smearing is done. And sometimes the smears are terrible. When that picture of that young boy was laying on the beach in Syria, the smear that was put on the Conservative government was amazing, because that is a catastrophe that's been 10 years in the making. And that's a smear that affected our country and my party and was not honest in its application. So smears are done by every party, and it's not just the Conservatives.
Thank you. A redirect from Ms. Antonucci.
Yes, I definitely disagree with Martin on this one. I mean, I think even all of you have heard the, he's just not ready, but he's got good hair, though. Or you've heard Mean Tom. And we don't really hear about Elizabeth May, but what the Conservative government has effectively done is kept her silenced and away from the debates that would be meaningful for the citizens in this country to hear her voice of reason and her knowledge and holding the big boys to the issues with actual data. And so I think the smear campaigns move forward at different levels, and I would disagree that the Conservative government has had the least smear campaign.
Thank you. From this side?
This is for the Conservative candidate. What is your plan to help with the Syrian refugee crisis, like your party's?
That is a big issue, and as I was mentioning, it was part of a big smear campaign by the NDP. Canada is doing a lot of work in that issue. We're helping 1.2 million refugees directly. We supply products to over 4 million refugees. We have supplied water to 16 million people in that region. Right now, there's 14 million refugees there, and Canada is taking in many of them. But we cannot take in as many as my opponents would like to bring in because we do not have the infrastructure. And we also have to screen those people. You know, there's many oppressed groups there, and Canada is trying to reach out to the groups that are truly oppressed. The ones who go into refugee camps and get oppressed in the refugee camps, the Yazidis, the Coptic Christians, and those people are experiencing genocide in that region, and those are the people that the government is trying to help in large numbers.
Thank you. Mr. McGregor was the first one with his hand up, but I'm going to allow actually 2 more redirects thereafter because this is an enormous topic and I'm allowed. Go ahead.
Well, I'll take issue with your description of that being a smear campaign. The fact of the matter is that the Conservatives' very own immigration minister, Chris Alexander, twice, a few months ago on As It Happens, and then more recently on Power and Politics, could not answer a simple question of how many Syrian refugees were in Canada. Now, for a minister to dodge that sort of a question or not even have the most up-to-date data, it speaks to something else, and it means they've been putting up roadblocks to getting effective settlement of Syrian refugees in Canada for many years now. I worked in Jean Crowder's office for 7 years. I saw firsthand how the Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration Canada works. It's been affected by cutbacks, embassy closures. The processing times are going through the roof. And the fact of the matter is, we could be doing a lot more. What is missing from the whole equation is political will. The NDP has it, and we will bring it forward. Thank you.
Mr. Krahenhoff.
Well, thank you. And the Liberal government takes this problem very seriously. We are committed to admitting 25,000 Syrian refugees into Canada, increasing the amount that are currently being processed. As well, and equally importantly, we are going to commit to the whole system in terms of refugee and immigration processing of making it much speedier. We have certain standards in place where we screen refugees, but we want faster and more efficient processing, and we're going to dedicate money to that. As I mentioned earlier, we want to increase our commitment to foreign aid so that we can help resolve these problems in place as opposed to having them in Canada. But we're also going to be streamlining the family reunification process. A big part of this, though, is we don't act in isolation on this. The United Nations, since World War II, has had the High Commission on Refugees. We want to work closely with them as a partner as they find the best homes for refugees, and we want to be a home for that. We are committing $100 million to the UNHCR to help them with their mandate to help settle refugees from around the world, wherever they come from, as efficiently and effectively as possible. Thank you.
Hang on, we have one more opportunity for redirect.
We believe we need an overhaul of our immigration and refugee policies, and the Green Party's leader, Elizabeth May, has called for immediate action. We need to get in and provide some help immediately, particularly for the women and children. We have asked that we use our military equipment and go in and help immediately and get things moving off the ground, and that we target 40,000 over the next 5 years. This goes back to what I stated earlier. We have lost our reputation. We have lost our way. We are a big and giving and rich country, and we are only made better by the diversity in which we embrace differences. And we need to be able to have policies that put in place where immigrants' credentials be recognized. If they're a doctor in their country, well, let's recognize that sooner and let's unite families. Canada has been part of the process of dropping airstrikes there, and we don't expect them to run to try to protect their families. This is backwards. The whole situation is backwards.
Thank you. Sorry, again, I'm not trying to be rude. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I have a question for Fran and the Green Party, and you've touched on this already, actually, and it's obviously very near to your heart. So when broached with the question of the murdered and missing First Nations women, Stephen Harper said, just a sec, it isn't really that high on our radar, to be honest. So I was wondering, what is your view on that statement, and what would you do to help the issue?
Well, I think it's indicative of just the overall leadership in this country right now. And talking from a personal experience, in my little village of Quatsino, we only have a population of 300. And a young lady, the age of my daughter, left home to go to Vancouver in May of 2010, was never seen again after she hit the streets of Vancouver. And just recently here on Penelakut Island, young Didi was found also. So this is a real issue, and if it isn't important enough for our Canadian government to actually set in motion a national inquiry, then again, we have a drastic problem with leadership. We will continue to fight, keep this very out in the forefront.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much. Mr. Barker had an opportunity for redirect.
Thank you very much. This is an issue that is a true tragedy in Canada, and nobody is denying that. The fact is there is many studies on this exact topic. The government is currently consulting on 42 of the studies. There have been nearly 60 studies. The murders get solved at the same rate as the murders in the regular population do. And it's now time to act. It's not time to have another billion-dollar inquiry. It's time to spend money helping those women. And the Conservative government is spending $250 million on the various things that might help these women. They're creating shelters. They're creating education systems. And there's other things that the government's doing, trying to create First Nation prosperity, because many of the First Nations people are suffering in poverty. And there's a lot of issues involved here. The Conservative government is choosing to act now.
Thank you. Question from the right of the House.
I know some of the other candidates already answered this, so I'll just address the Conservative representative. If you're elected and your party was introducing policy that you felt was contrary to the needs of your constituency or constituents, how would you handle this?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a question that every MP faces when you're in Parliament, because the fact is you're elected on the policies of your party. And it's nice to think that you can be an individual person, but that's not really entirely how it works. When, for example, the Conservatives are running on the platform of lower taxes, and so that's part of my platform. The NDP are running on a platform of more revenue or more international markets for our oil. It would be hard for you as a member of that party to stand against that. You kind of have to stand with your party on most things. But there are some things that you can stand against. And if it's really important, you have to. That is your responsibility. And there are ways that you can be in what's called caucus or in committee, where you can try and reform the ideas. And the Prime Minister Harper is well known for changing his ideas when you can approach him individually or in caucus meetings and say, well, this is not good for what's going to happen in my riding.
Thank you very much. Redirect? No? Then moving over to the left.
My question is for Mr. Barker. I realize this is a question that is on more of a federal level, but you do represent the party that is currently in power. So my question is, how do you plan to keep up Canada's defense against foreign aggressors with a military that is currently dwindling and an economy or a national debt that is now in the trillions?
To set you straight, the national debt is not in the trillions. It's $650 billion. It's actually the lowest it's been in decades as far as debt to GDP ratios, which is what most world economists judge your debt on, and we are the lowest among the G20. As far as the military goes, the only government that's ever invested in the military is Conservatives. We've essentially doubled the investment in the military, but the fact is that during the dark ages of the Liberals, military spending was cut drastically, and they were sent to international wars. You know, our military outside of the Navy is doing very well. Like, they're very well equipped, they have modern gear. Our Navy doesn't have the infrastructure right now to build, because all that infrastructure was removed post-Trudeau years. And so right now we have a big shipbuilding procurement that is being delayed because we have no infrastructure to build our own Navy. And that's what's happening right now. The only party that cares and invests in the military is the Conservative government.
Thank you. Ms. Hunter-Nucci's redirect?
Yes, so in relation to foreign investors, basically what we've been doing is signing Canada's sovereignty away. It becomes the big corporations before the interests of the people where we can be sued. So the Green Party has stood up against these foreign trade agreements for starters. In fact, it was Elizabeth May and Bruce Heyer were the only two to oppose the Korea trade agreement. We're also saying no to TPP. We need to look at fair trade. And as far as the military, we need a strong military, but we also need to invest money into the equipment required to be able to respond in times of catastrophe. Climate change is here. It's moving, and look on the news, floods, earthquakes, and we need to be able to respond. We need to be able to get our military veterans back to where they were with their benefits, not lump sum. We need to invest in equipment. We need to ensure that they have the benefits for life for their injuries, that they have guide dogs for post-traumatic stress disorder. The military is one of our priorities, and people may think, well, that's a Green Party, but it is.
Thank you. Question from the right.
My question is for Liberal candidate Mr. Kranhoff. There's been a lot of talk today about Canada's presence overseas, both boots on the ground and financially, but my question is more, how does the Liberal Party plan to take care of veterans as our current system is clearly lacking?
Well, thank you. Yeah, we've got a very distinct plan with respect to veterans, and just so you know, I've got a background in the RCMP. I was in the Army Reserves, and I'm also a member of the Royal Canadian Legion. When I talk to these veterans, they know that I can hear them and understand their concerns. We've got veterans who really need our help, and we want to speed up the time that we can deal with their questions and deal with their issues, deal with their medical concerns. We have a plan for retraining veterans who are leaving the military and going into civilian life, an education program. We want to help military families who need to support the veterans who they have now and their families, injured veterans. And so it'll be a very comprehensive plan that meets the needs of injured veterans. PTSD is a big problem. We basically need to help these folks get back on their feet as fast as possible, and we are very much committed to do that as a national party, and for myself, that's a priority issue in this riding. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not giving you enough of time, Mr. McGregor, so I'm going to allow you first redirect and then second to our Conservative Party candidate.
Sure. Thank you for the great question. In my time working in the constituency office here locally, I had the opportunity and the honor to help many veterans over 7 years with a lot of the problems that they were having with Veterans Affairs. And, you know, it's the same problem that agency was witnessing cutbacks, closure of offices. And by and large, you know, we've just seen a deterioration of the services offered to men and women who once wore the uniform. And I think that anyone who steps forward and volunteers for our military, they deserve to have a show of respect and gratitude for the service that they gave and to be looked after when they need help. You know, I've met many with PTSD and who are struggling with the wounds that they carry physically and mentally. And I just think that it's incumbent on a country to look after those who once served our country so honorably. I will take forward to Ottawa the experience I personally had in that office. It's something I will always remember as I go forward in MP. And like Luke said, big priority for me too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barker.
Thank you. As you go forward to vote, it's really important that you have your facts straight, because the facts are not always presented in an honest manner. The fact is that spending on veterans has increased 35% under the Conservative government. They closed regional offices, 8 of them, and sent those offices into Service Canada, 640 of them, increasing the service that are available to veterans. There's been a network of frontline mental health clinics across Canada, and there are now 31 integrated support centers. These are to help veterans. There's now up to $100,000 for each military veteran who's been injured who needs vocational training. There's new family relief benefits to help with care, up to a value of $7,000 per year. There's improved permanent impairment allowances, improved hearing loss benefits. Hundreds of new case managers and frontline people are being hired. This is not a government that is ignoring the veterans, as my friends here would like you to think. The fact is the Conservatives are investing in our veterans, and we truly appreciate our veterans' service.
Thank you. From the left.
This question is directed to Mr. Barker of the Conservative Party. You continue to state that Canada is the best country in the world, and although I agree with you, I'm from an international background, and I've been living in Canada for 6 years now. As we've noticed from the gentleman's passionate question, not all Canadians are necessarily proud of everything in the Canadian government that is happening. So don't you believe your stance can perhaps influence your ability to fix some of Canada's biggest problems?
Thank you for your question. I feel like I've answered this once before, but you can go on to international study. It takes 1 out of 10 international settled refugees. That is an amazing number. Canada has every reason to be proud, and I would invite you to Google search in legitimate sources, and you'll see Canada ranks essentially top 5 in everything.
Thank you. Mr. McGregor.
I just wanted to concentrate on one particular issue that I think our country really needs to address, and that is relations with Canada's First Peoples. I was incredibly proud to see last week Tom Mulcair come and sit with Chief Perry Bellegarde, the AFN National Chief. And we released a very detailed First Nations platform, about 14 to 16 pages long, detailing the immediate steps that we want to bring about if we form government. And when Tom Mulcair was asked what kind of a lasting legacy he would like to leave if he became Prime Minister, he said it was to finally heal the relationship with Canada's First Nations. I see that as it's a dark stain on our past as a country. We still have not gone nearly far enough. There's some great recommendations in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We will act on those in deep consultation with all of Canada's First Nations. But I think that is one major issue that our country needs to really take.
Thank you very much. From the right, my right.
This is for Mr. Baker. Okay, Barker. Well, man, so I was wondering why you were, why the Conservatives are like, their sixth platform is investing in like lobsters, and well, I was wondering why the heck you would do that if you guys are planning to like put a pipeline in the Pacific or something in an earthquake zone.
What you're asking.
So this is your opportunity for your own redirect. Maybe rephrase that question carefully, please, and avoid any use of It'd be helpful.
Okay. Well.
It's hard, I know.
Well, so you. What? Well, so you guys are the Conservatives. Have all these platforms, and they're investing in the lobster industry. You know, fishing for lobsters, but you, Stephen Harper has plans to like put a pipeline in the Pacific Ocean, I guess, and since it's an earthquake zone, if there is an earthquake, the whole pipeline could kill all the fishies and stuff, and including lobsters. Think of the lobsters, man.
Thank you.
Hey.
Are you clapping because he got to the end of the question or because of the question? Good luck, Mr. Barker.
So what I think I'm hearing is your concern about pipelines and environment. There is support for lobster fisheries on the East Coast. There's no lobsters on the West Coast. There is currently no talk of putting a pipeline into the Pacific Ocean. What is being talked about is running pipelines to ports that will consequently be hauled by tankers. Now, the tanker traffic and pipelines are extremely safe. And as long as we drive, as long as we pave roads, we're going to be using oil. And that's true around the world. And we have to choose the way that is the safest and the most environmentally friendly. And pipelines, and I'm not commenting on, each pipeline is its own thing. The National Energy Board has a very extensive process to do that. But it is not safe to transport oil by rail car. And just to put it in context, in the East Coast, they have 16 times the tanker traffic that we have on the West Coast. And on the West Coast in BC, there has never been a tanker spill on our coastline. There has been oil spills. But, are we going to ban grain ship because it spilled bunker oil?
Thank you. Come to a point. Last sentence.
No, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Hunt-Janucci.
Thank you for your question. That's a very astute question because it doesn't make sense, does it? On one hand, the evidence is in about climate change, and yet we're still talking about oil expansion, liquefied natural gas, which is hydraulic fracturing, which requires our water. So it doesn't make sense. We need to diversify our economy and provide options. I also, and I've asked this question before, I don't agree with just looking at us as consumers and we don't have a choice and we don't have a future. Do we want to be consumers or do we want to be citizens? And I think together we can make some sound decisions. And I think that having policies where we're just trying to increase the review process is not good enough.
Thank you.
My question is to the Green Party. You were talking about Canada losing its reputation, like its international face. I can kind of agree with that, but my question is, how are you going to regain this face, this international face?
Well, I think we have to work very hard to reverse the damage of the last 10 or 12 years. And, you know, an example is Elizabeth May has been the only leader from Ottawa to attend any of the climate summits that have been held worldwide. I believe it was 2010, 2012, and 2013. And the woman had to go representing another country. We had no leadership there. So that being a first step, and she said it was so sad to be laughed at, for Canada to be mocked. Why are you even here, Elizabeth? Your country isn't going to support this. In the last 35 years, we have elected 5 Liberal governments, 5 Conservative governments, and provincially 12 NDP governments. We have had that amount of time to get serious and have strong, bold action against climate. So there are other things, but I ran out of time.
Thank you. Mr. Krahenhoff for a redirect.
Thank you. Well, we've talked about our international reputation as well, and our reputation as peacekeepers. And I think it's also important to consider our reputation as a producer of dirty oil. And we need to constrain that, and we need to deal with that. I see the role of government as one that takes the output of any industry and internalizes it. If you can't produce a good cleanly and without impact on the economy within environmental limits, then just don't be in that business. And that's one of the theoretical roles of government that I really support. And also we have an international reputation that has suffered with respect to our treatment of First Nations. And the Liberal government is committing to implement all of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was a very powerful process, and we want to follow through with that and further the healing that was started. And one of those is signing the UN Declaration with respect to Aboriginal persons, and that is essential as part of the overall mandate that we have to restore our reputation domestically and internationally. Thank you.
This question is for the Liberal candidate. The Liberal Party has stated that they plan to increase taxes for wealthy Canadians in order to lower them for the middle class. So, my question is, why does your party believe that wealthy Canadians deserve to pay significantly more in tax dollars in order to support the rest of Canada?
Well, basically it's a question of fairness, and we think the role of government, and I talked about it a little earlier, what is the role of government? It's with respect to industry, it's to constrain it and make sure that all the internal costs are accounted for. With respect to individual citizens, it is to help those who need help. We don't need to send child benefit checks to millionaires, and our wealthiest Canadians can support the modest tax increase that we're proposing. What we want to focus on is the middle class. We think they have been left behind, and hey, some might not agree with us, but that's what we're standing up for. We want to support the middle class and those who want to be in the middle class with tax breaks, with a better child tax benefit. We're calling it the Canada Child Benefit. It'll be tax-free, and the amount going to families will increase. And we think that these are the people who most need our help, and we believe that those who make over $200,000 can afford the modest increase that we're proposing.
Thank you. Mr. Barker.
Thank you. That's a great question. And we have to ask ourselves, can we keep milking the golden goose? The top 1% earn 10% of all income but pay 20% of all taxes. That's a lot to start with. Corporations pay a significant amount of tax, and studies have shown as you increase taxes, that revenue goes down. The Conservative government has a policy of creating the lowest taxes they can. And right now, the average Canadian is paying the lowest taxes they have since the 1950s. And that's a process that has brought prosperity and wealth to our country. Our government revenues continue to climb with a low taxation. And further, we're directing tax breaks to groups that need it, with income splitting to seniors and families. There's new increased tax deductions for families. If re-elected, there'll be new tax deductions for seniors. The average family now has $6,600, a family of 4, in their pockets than before. And my friends at this table want to increase that load on everyday Canadians.
Thank you.
This question is for the gentleman representing the NDP. Your party wants to raise taxes on corporations by 2%. The Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses said that this will cost 150,000 jobs. In light of this, how will your corporate tax hike benefit the Canadian economy?
Excellent question, and I'm glad you raised it. I think for far too long we've seen the current government's approach to taxation. They have reduced it. I think it was at a high of 22%, and it's come down now to 15%. The Governor of the Bank of Canada has publicly stated that there's far too much corporate cash swirling around in bank accounts, and the tax cuts that have been brought about have not resulted in increased jobs. In fact, Canadians are finding it harder and harder to get by. The job opportunities just aren't there. And so what we have proposed is a modest increase. It's going to go from 15% to 17%, and that rate is still going to be well below the OECD average, below what the United States pays, and well below the average for the entire time of the Harper government. So we just feel that by asking corporations to pay a little bit more of their fair share, it's going to lessen the burden on everyone else.
Thank you. Mr. Barker, redirect.
Yeah, I just want to set the facts straight. You say 2%, but if you work it out, it's actually a 13% increase in corporate taxation. Quite clearly, if you look at Ontario, which is Liberal, and Alberta, which is NDP, which raise their corporate taxes, business is not doing well, and jobs are being lost. The Conservative government have slowly lowered taxation, and 1.3 million jobs were created since 2008, the most of any country in the G20. You know, it's shown that corporate taxation and companies need to be willing to do business. If they shut their businesses down, there are no jobs, there's lost revenues from personal taxation, and we need to keep our companies strong and vibrant and competitive in the world market, and that's what the Conservatives are doing.
Thank you. He's fine. He'll be up again anyway. Go ahead.
This question is for the representative of the NDP. Your party has talked a lot about how they plan on bringing in $15 a day childcare. I was just sort of wondering how you plan on doing this, since even though it is a federal issue, a lot of the provinces do have varying standards, with some provinces being very high, others being very low, and prices varying depending on what province you're in or what area of the province. So how do you plan on standardizing it, making it so that everyone can afford this and businesses don't suffer because of the $15 a day limit?
Sure. You're right. Provinces are going to play a central role in this, and we have never said that we want to implement a one-size-fits-all system. We will work with each provincial government to find out what works best for them. It will take some time to roll out. Big social programs like this always do, but we wouldn't be having this conversation if previous governments had lived up to their promises to bring in childcare. It would actually be implemented right now. What I would say is that, you know, the work-life balance conflicts that happen to parents with young children actually costs the Canadian business societies about $4 billion a year. It's estimated that for every dollar you invest in childcare, you get $2 put back into the GDP, and governments will find upwards of $3 billion in additional revenue simply by allowing parents to find that other job. It's going to take a while, but it does make good social sense and good economic sense. I know this not only as a parent of young children myself, but from the countless parents I've met over the last 7 years and all the ones I've been knocking on doors on. It's a good policy with a lot of support.
Thank you. What do the Greens have to say about this?
Yeah, with respect to the NDP and to Alistair, I mean, it's a good campaign promise, but it seems far away to be achievable, especially in light of where provinces are at and expecting them to pay up to 40% of that cost to get it to $15. I think even Rachel Notley in Alberta has said maybe 25%. There's been conversations, and that plan is about 8 to 10 years down the line. What we propose to do is to accelerate workplace seats, to encourage employers to create seats for their employees, keep parents together. They would receive a $1,500 per child tax credit. It allows mothers or fathers closer access to their children and creates a place where there isn't all this traveling of dropping children off. And we think there are more holistic ways, a guaranteed livable income, the carbon fee, a number of ways to support people to have the funds for childcare without making the big promises that are hard to achieve.
Thank you. One moment. Students at Brentwood, I realize that you're getting a bit shifty in your seats. Please know that you are allowed to be 10 minutes into your 5th block next class and that you are expected to go thereafter. We've only got 12 minutes left here, and we'd love for you to stay. You are allowed to. Of course, it's up to you, but you need to be either here or in your class. Nowhere betwixt, okay? Thank you. Let's move on to the next. Yes?
My question is directed to the Conservative candidate. Stephen Harper says that marijuana is more harmful than tobacco, even though all scientific research says the opposite. I would like to know your main reasons for opposing the legalization of marijuana.
Thank you so much for your question. I hope it's not too important a question here. But the Conservative government has actually done the most of any government in Canadian history to make medical marijuana available and to ensure that the quality controls are there for medical marijuana. The facts are, though, is that for our youth, marijuana is dangerous and it does harm to you. And you can see it on MRIs. Your brain actually changes. There's mood differentials, and it's very harmful to our children. And legalizing marijuana is not the way to send a message to our youth that marijuana is dangerous and should not be consumed by young people. That's why I personally will be supporting the Conservative message of not legalizing marijuana. It's widely available through medical purposes already, and I believe we're doing the right thing.
Thank you. Mr. Krahenhoff for a redirect.
Well, thank you. And I was starting to wonder if perhaps the question had been prohibited. I was surprised it took so long to come up. So anyways, that's a great question. So again, by way of background, I'm a former RCMP officer. And when I was in the RCMP, I thought marijuana is wrong because it is illegal. But that's not how you look at the question. You look at the question of how do Canadians as a whole vote on this issue? How do they feel about it? And with its widespread usage, there's a common sense consensus that some use is okay. I don't think that excessive use is healthy, and Mr. Barker has, or Dr. Barker has suggested some of the things around that. There's some suggestions it might cause schizophrenia. But the question is, should it be prohibited? We say no. We say we're tired of the Hells Angels and organized crime becoming incredibly rich on this, and we want it to be legalized like tobacco so we can study it and be educated so that people can make their own choice like they have with cigarettes, whether this is right or wrong and excessive use versus modest use. So we've got the most progressive campaign on that and promise on that.
Thank you. Because of its importance, again, I'm going to break with my own tradition here and go with one more redirect. Ms. Huntanucci.
Thank you.
You want one as well, Mr. Gregor? Fine, we'll do two more. Go ahead.
Yes, the Green Party proposes to legalize marijuana, and there are a number of uses. There's industrial use for hemp. We can be also using that along with replanting new trees. There's a lot of uses. In my own fridge, I'm buying little hemp seed hearts to go with my porridge in the morning. Cost me $14 a bag. So we need to look at it differently. We need to take the criminal element out of it, as my colleague here said, and the costs and savings to the justice system would be great. But we can't take it lightly. In the same way that we have oversight on alcohol and tobacco, it would have to be the same way, and we would be able to provide better education to youth, to the harmful aspects of it as well. But there are people that are dying from fentanyl-laced marijuana. I think that there's more safety when there is oversight. And there are lots of uses that have been used for thousands of years that have been helpful as well.
Thank you. Mr. McGregor.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Mr. Krahenhoff because I think his views as a former RCMP officer, it's very insightful, just showing how far we've progressed as a society on this topic. And, you know, to throw out a few more facts and figures, here in British Columbia alone, it's estimated that the cannabis trade is worth $6 billion a year. That's $6 billion that is unaccountable to any government. It's going around on the black market. And so, I mean, we have to approach this with, I think, an adult conversation. its use is there. Ignoring it is not going to make it go away. I think it's time for government to get involved, to start regulating it, start studying it. My approach is to do immediate decriminalization, but I am certainly open to going beyond that. I think we've got two excellent examples in Colorado and Washington states to study and to see how that could work in Canada, but I think it needs further conversation to see what our society is prepared to do. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time perhaps for one, certainly one, maybe two more questions. So make them good, folks. Here we go.
Because this is a bilingual country, I'd like to ask my question to any candidate who can speak or at the very least understand French by a show of hands, please. Okay, I'll ask in English. Just so my question is for the Conservative Party candidate. Canada is the second largest country in the world, yet most of the political pull comes from the tiny GTA area. So for all those many regions, for example, Northern Ontario, who are less populous, how would you improve the government in a way that they can be represented too? Because they do matter.
Well, that's a good question. Everybody matters in the country, and that's why the most recent boundaries were changed based on a recent census. Each boundary right now represents hopefully about 100,000 people. And the people in Northern Ontario are hopefully in ridings of about 100,000 people. But the important part is each Canadian's vote is hopefully worth the same. You know, before the boundaries changed, here in this riding, our votes were worth among the least in the country, because we had among the largest riding in the country. So when they redid the boundaries, and hopefully they did this in Northern Ontario, the boundaries will be changed and people get one vote. You can always have representation through your MP. So if there's a special need for a group, you would hopefully go to your MP and they would advocate directly to the government or to whichever group would need, whichever group could give help that riding would need.
Thank you, Mr. Kranhoff, for redirect.
And with respect to the initial part of your question, and it relates to smaller communities and also minority rights, and it was a Liberal government that brought in bilingualism and biculturalism. Two of my daughters took French immersion and are fluent, and that was a program that was brought in by the first Trudeau government. We brought in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees minority rights, and so if you have a language group, a French language group within a population that meets a certain threshold, you get the right of education in that language. And so we're a mosaic of communities, of small communities, large communities, immigrant groups, French groups, English groups, and it's about making sure that everybody feels heard regardless of where they come from, and I think we've got the best record on doing that and implementing that.
Thank you. I'm going to break with tradition a third and probably last time and allow Ms. Hunt-Janucci to weigh in here as she would like to very much.
Thank you. This is a big one for me, and first of all, I support what was said here. I just want to put on the floor also the need to help to revitalize Indigenous languages. I'm very lucky and blessed that I know my language, which is Kwakwala, because I grew up in an isolated little native village with my grandparents. But our languages were taken away from us. In BC alone, with First Nations languages, we have over 50 with various dialects, and even on this island. And as part of the reconciliation process, it will be very important that Canadians understand the value of our language and to support us being able to revitalize it, because many of the speakers are gone. In some communities, the languages are completely wiped out. So we have a country rich in original languages, and we need to make a strong stand to ensure that that is brought back to life.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm sorry, folks. For those of you who still have some questions, we will not have time to actually entertain them. So feel free to have a seat and then just listen to me for about a minute and a half. I said we would finish on time because this is a marathon, particularly for our folks on stage here, and so we want to be respectful of their time as well as our other guests. First of all, thank you very much for attending today. Thank you for conducting yourselves well. Thank you to our local elementary school, Nicole Cobble Hill, where my son goes to school, for attending. Woo! And also thank you to all of our guests here who are not part of Brentwood College, but you're most welcome here, and I thank you for coming. I think it's fair to say that our candidates, in addition to having tables with material out in the foyer, would be happy to speak with you immediately following this meeting for perhaps a few more questions. Is that fair? So you have that opportunity because our students, right after I finish speaking, will need to go off to 5th block. You are expected there. They will be taking attendance. You are not going to lunch. Clear? Very quickly, I want to thank the candidates on stage here because they've highlighted some similarities and some differences between several different platforms. And this, if this isn't exciting, then I think we need to relook at that definition. The NDP, thank you for your innovative ways in which you would propose to do some of the spending should you come to power. Carefully reevaluating things that we do in education, the refugees, and I heard things about the First Nations peoples as well from your party. The Greens Party, I think we need to remember the fact that they are not simply about the environment, but in fact a much more diverse and credible of issues, which Ms. Hunt-Danucci has weighed in on eloquently today, social justice and education included. The Conservatives, they have the hardest seat in the House right now. They've been in power for the last many years, and so it's much easier to defend a position that no one has had to use for the last decade. They're in the hot seat because they're having to defend something that's happening right now. I thank Mr. Barker for highlighting factual differences, factual changes, to make sure that when we go to the polls and vote, that we actually know what we're talking about factually. The Liberal Party candidate, Mr. Krahenhoff, thank you for your familiarity with local issues. I heard you mention the Bemerton proposal just down the hill here. A lot of the distortions in terms of how we do the military. And also a Liberal Party tradition that reaches right back to our own Canadian Charter back in '82, of course, which your party is responsible for. So you are encouraged, and it's not my place to tell you anything more than you need to vote with your conscience, but you do absolutely need to vote. And while you, ladies and gentlemen on the stage, may not be aware of this, there's a number within our audience, even our student body, who are able to vote legally, or are about to. And so this is exceedingly important, and we're very grateful for the 4 of you having attended, because we know how difficult it is to fit in any time. We're 6 days away from an election, folks, and they've come here today. Why don't you congratulate them for that? All right. I would ask then that Brentwood students would leave in an orderly fashion to class, and anyone else who'd like to stick around, join us in the foyer. If you folks wouldn't mind staying here for a photo, we'll take a quick one.